Sen de uzun uzun konuşacağız
Evet,
ama
evet.
hemen bir röportajımız var. Bilderberg'in kodlarını dünyada en iyi çözenlerden biri. Dünyaca ünlü İngiliz gazeteci Tony Gosling.
Tony, tabii Tony
Evet,
çok iyi bilir bu işleri.
Tony acayip açıklamaları var.
Tony çok uzun zamandır takip ediyor ve yine binanın oralardaydı Tony.
Tony oradaydı.
Evet.
Bakın Tony Yazboz'a neler anlattı. İzliyoruz.
And that they have been trying to organise uprisings. I mean, the first one, the EU is Bilderberg's baby, and they don't want it destroyed. We had last. I think that the Bilderberg really is the gang that killed President Kennedy. Well, I think to understand Bilderberg, you've really got to look at the origins of these conferences. They started 10 years after the end of the Second World War in a place called Oosterbeek in Holland. The reason I've discovered for the origin of Bilderberg at the Bilderberg Hotel in Oosterbeek is because that's where a big battle was fought at the end of the Second World War. It's portrayed in a very famous war film, A Bridge Too Far. And in that place, the British were massacred because of traitors within the Allies. And that allowed the war to carry on for an extra 4 or 5 months, which allowed Martin Bormann and other Nazis to smuggle much of the looted wealth of Europe out of Nazi Germany. That was crucial, really, because it allowed the setting up of a kind of clandestine mafia made up from people who were supporting the Nazis and funded by the something like $6 or $7 billion that the Nazis had at the end of the war. And so that's why the Bilderberg meetings started in Holland, in this particular place for this battle. But after the war, the meetings have been really about the creation of a United States of Europe. The Americans at the end of World War II were fed up with having to deal with 30 different embassies, and they set up something called the European Movement, and they put a great deal of influence on Europe in order to stop them, as they're doing with Germany now, for example, making pacts and alliances and trading agreements with the Soviet Union and the Russians. And so in parallel, really, the European Union was set up along with NATO in order to keep Europe's 500 million people in a very close political and military alliance with the United States. Well, anyone who's embarked on the project of setting up a United States of Europe, it started as the United States of Europe. It started as the European Economic Community. Now it's European Union, which is a fully political union. Also, they're talking about now a European army. This is really what the project's about, and it's very difficult to sell that to the public. If you were to ask people in Europe to vote for a United States of Europe, a European army with 500 million people all controlled from Brussels, I don't think there's a single person who would vote for it. So that's why it's so secretive, is because you've got a project which people would not want if they were told about it. It's also fair to say that you have financial criminals at the Bilderberg conferences. You look at the big banks like HSBC, who've been sued for money laundering in the United States, so with drug money, for example. Now, these criminals I mean, this has been proven in the US courts. It's not just me saying this. They're very worried that people are going to, I suppose, get to know that the banking system is so crooked. Again, another good reason for secrecy. The problem here is the banks look at the sorts of fines that they're getting, and they realize that they can get a lot more money from dealing with the drug cartels, other sorts of criminal activity, than they're ever going to be fined for. The other type of war criminals that are in the Bilderberg are those war criminals like Henry Kissinger. Kissinger has been involved For example, in the Indonesian coup in the 1970s, again in the 1970s, in the coup in Chile, the illegal bombing of Cambodia, and there's some British writers that even connect him to the Turkish invasion of Cyprus. So many accuse Kissinger of being one of the world's actually greatest war criminals. In fact, Christopher Hitchens wrote a book called The Trials of Henry Kissinger. And in that book, he asks a very big question, which is, why is this guy not in jail? Is it just that there are some people at the Bilderberg, including Henry Kissinger, who's running what some say is one of the world's greatest protection rackets? Why are they not in jail? Are they too big to jail? Okay, so there's probably fair to say there's three different levels of the Bilderberg. At the very bottom level are the people who are invited in for the first time, maybe, or the second time, because it's a kind of vetting procedure. So these are maybe newspaper editors, politicians, business people from around Europe and the United States and Canada, and they are being invited in really to be vetted. So the Bilderberg will listen very carefully to what they say. They will chat to them in the bar and this kind of thing to see if they are speaking anything against the Pentagon. If they say something against the Pentagon, then their name will be marked down and they won't be invited back. In fact, they might find that their career is in tatters within a few months of the Bilderberg conferences. So that's the first level, which is the people who are being schmoozed by royalty, etc. And those are the ones who are I suppose they're looking for job prospects, their career to be advanced and to gain power in the future. At the middle level is what's called the Bilderberg Steering Committee. We have on there people like Eric Schmidt from Google, John Soares, the former head of the British Foreign Secret Service. Those are both there. And that steering committee does the setting of the agenda and the inviting. At the very top are a handful of people who are the movers and shakers, that is to say, families like the Rockefellers, many say the Rothschilds as well, at the very top funding Bilderberg. And Henry Kissinger is a very central figure. If you talk to the bar staff, as we did at the Taschenberg Palace this year, every year they say the same thing. The center of attention is Henry Kissinger. Kissinger was born in Germany and went into the American Army, and then he worked his way up through to the State Department. But when he finished as Secretary of State under Richard Nixon, he never gave up on international politics. And now he lives at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel permanently in New York, and he really runs a kind of private diplomatic service for the United States, working primarily for those that make money out of war, that is to say, the military-industrial complex. And some have called the Bilderberg Club the Military-Industrial Complex Appreciation Society. Well, for example, one of the German journalists I was speaking to at the Bilderberg conference explained that the German Secret Service invited the very first participants to the very first Bilderberg conference. The Secret Services have always been very closely involved with Bilderberg. And of course, MI6 and the CIA are two of the most notorious. Many now say that these are both criminal organizations and that they have been trying to organize uprisings. I mean, the first one, I suppose you could say, was in the 1980s in Afghanistan, an uprising against the Russian occupation of Afghanistan. And they've been doing it ever since. We've seen more recently also in, of course, in Iraq and Syria, the rising of ISIS. We saw before that the funding of rebels who are in Libya. And this sort of thing seems to be the normal way now to institute regime change. Inject terrorists into the country, help and fund them, and then all of a sudden you've created a terrible problem, and then the West has to come in and intervene militarily. So the United Nations has been thrown out, really, I'm afraid, from the international scene. We've just heard very much just in the last couple of days that the Israelis are now running the judicial committee at the United Nations, and the Saudi Arabians are running the Human Rights Committee. Well, it seems that the days of the United Nations may be limited if these war criminal countries and financial criminal countries are running things at the United Nations. I think it's probably true that the decisions are not actually made at the Bilderberg conferences. They are made really more by the steering committee and the powerful people on the Bilderberg steering committee. The point of the conference is more to schmooze the powerful. That is to bring them in to try and get them on board the program. The sorts of things that they will be deciding, I think, are very quiet and secret. For example, rumors have come out of the Bilderberg conference in 2002 about the possible invasion of Iraq. Nobody believed in 2002 that was ever going to happen, but it did. And I think that's the extreme wall of secrecy makes it very difficult to know. One thing's for sure, the global economy is on a cliff edge. And so I would imagine Bilderberg have some way of coping with that situation. Now, the problem here being that they can actually make money out of a crash. And we could be facing something like the 1929 crash, but even worse the next time. So I think that the Bilderbergs, whatever happens, they always make money, because if it looks like the economy is going to go down, they bet on that, and then they collect on their bets. Nobody really in the Bilderberg conference will be saying anything good about Britain leaving the EU. The EU is Bilderberg's baby, and they don't want it destroyed. We had last year the Greeks voting against the Troika, and still they couldn't get the drachma back, and they couldn't leave the European Union. But it looks like Britain next week may be going to trigger the beginning of the end of the European Union by Brexit. There will be a big struggle because a lot of the politicians in Britain are bought already by the European Union. So whatever the people vote here in the UK, it may be that the politicians want to keep Britain in the EU. And so then you've got the makings of even something like a civil war, possibly, with the people deciding one thing and the politicians deciding to ignore it. That's quite dangerous. So that's the sort of thing I would have thought that Bilderberg would have been discussing, talking about and thinking about. But as for the decisions, they keep that very secret. We spoke to the bar staff and they said that if they were to mention anything about Bilderberg, they'd immediately lose their jobs. They make a very, very good job of keeping the actual decisions being made in there secret. But you can be sure of one thing, and that is that there is a crisis, probably a financial crisis coming soon. You can be sure of one thing, and that is that there is a crisis, probably a financial crisis coming soon. That you see, you've got two major problems that there have been recently. You've got the financial crisis with the whole of Southern Europe under the Euro scheme, tricked by Goldman Sachs, who are the bankers of Bilderberg is Goldman Sachs, tricked by them into joining the Euro, and then finding that their economy, their industries are being sucked out of Spain, Italy and Greece into Germany. So the German economy is doing very well, but these other economies are not doing very well. So we've also got the refugee and the migrant crisis as well. The European Union has completely failed to deal with both of those crises, completely failed. And so many people around Europe are actually looking towards Britain and saying, we hope you do vote out, because this will send the strongest possible message to Angela Merkel, who's really more the president of Europe, to say you've got to get the EU working. Otherwise, that is the end for the European Union. I think that the Bilderberg really is the gang that killed President Kennedy. If you look at some of the figures in the CIA that funded Bilderberg and that funded the European movement, they're the same people who were behind the Bay of Pigs invasion and also behind the assassination of President Kennedy. If you now look into it, you'll find Mark Lane and others who died recently. He was a lawyer who was a friend of Kennedy, have made it very, very clear. It was Lyndon Johnson, it was the FBI and the CIA behind the death of Kennedy. And the same people profited immensely, made a lot of money out of the Vietnam War, for example, and are making the money out of wars today. So that's why I call Bilderberg the gang that killed Kennedy. And when I was speaking to some of the German police in Dresden, we had an amusing conversation about whether there would be more criminals on the inside of Bilderberg or on the outside. And the police were smiling, saying maybe we must have our handcuffs on some of the people inside, which is nice to hear from the German police, who are not noted for their sense of humor.
Evet Ergün, çarpıcı açıklamalar. Tony Wossing İngiltere'de çok ünlü bir gazeteci.